The smoked glass cabinet sits against a paneled living room wall in 1978. Warm dust rising as a Sansui 9090DB glows behind the door, and a handwritten upgrade receipt waits in the manual drawer. This is the story of the stereo brands that disappeared from the family living room. And the harder question is how a Sansui receiver can still be wanted online, while Sansui is no longer the name a family saves for at the stereo shop. That cabinet once held a household decision. It held the argument over speakers first or receiver first, the Saturday trip to hear both, and the quiet promise that one day the stack would be better. The answer is not simply that people stopped buying music gear, because the real disappearance is stranger and closer to home. On the sales floor, receivers, speakers, and component systems met ordinary families who came in with folded ads and a number they could not go past. The ones who bought carefully remembered every brand name, because every name had to survive dinner table negotiation before it ever made it into the living room. Before the component rack took over, many homes had a single furniture piece. A console could sit like a sideboard with a hinged lid, a turntable, a tuner, amplification, and speakers built into teak, walnut, or mahogany cabinetry. It made sound feel domestic, because the stereo looked like furniture before it looked like equipment. Then the 1970s made the living room more complicated. Component-based stereo systems rose in that decade, and the all-in-one cabinet gave way to separate receivers, loudspeakers, turntables, and tape decks. The old furniture decision became a stack of choices, and each carried its own brand reputation. That was the first loss. A family no longer had one cabinet to buy and keep quiet about. It had to learn which receiver was worth saving for, which speakers were worth stretching for, and which cassette deck could wait until Christmas. The receipt in the drawer mattered because the stereo competed with real household money. Groceries, gas, school clothes, and Christmas envelopes all sat beside the same number. The argument rarely sounded technical at first, because somebody wanted better speakers now, and somebody else wanted more power later. The 1970s are often remembered as a golden age, with silver faces, meters, big knobs, and speaker walls that made ordinary shoppers feel like judges. That memory has power, but it should be handled honestly. Not every old system was perfect, and nostalgia can polish a noisy switch as easily as a walnut cabinet. Still, the pride was real. A receiver face glowing after dinner could feel as familiar as the lamp and more guarded than the television. A teenager learned volume discipline from the click of a loudness button and the first moment the woofers started moving. The living room stereo then began to split into competing upgrades. The rack wanted a receiver, the receiver wanted speakers, the speakers wanted better wire, and the tape deck wanted blank cassettes and patience. The family stereo stopped being a single shared object and became a schedule of improvements. This is where disappeared brands become more complicated than closed companies. Fisher carried a founder-era hi-fi surname that once meant something serious to people comparing components. Avery Fisher is said to have founded Fisher Radio Corporation in New York City in 1945. And many vintage audio stories still connect that name with early separate hi-fi ambition. Then ownership began to move the meaning. Fisher was sold to Emerson Electric in 1969 for roughly $37 million. Then Emerson sold Fisher to Sanyo in 1975. By 2000, Sanyo had dropped the Fisher name, and Panasonic later bought Sanyo in 2011. The name did not vanish all at once from memory. It faded from the ritual that gave it weight. A Fisher 500 or Fisher X100 could still make sense to someone who knew the old language, but the family at the store was no longer learning Fisher as a living room promise. Here is the part the sales floor made plain. A brand could stay printed somewhere and still disappear from the way families made decisions, because the badge survived longer than the trust people attached to it. Sansui shows the same thing with more living room drama. Sansui is said to have been founded in Tokyo in 1947 by Kosaku Kikuchi, and by the 1970s, it had become one of the names tied to serious Japanese hi-fi. A Sansui 9090 dB behind smoked glass told visitors the household had entered the receiver wars. Many owners still remember that feeling more than any spec. The face, the knobs, the weight, and the glow all helped make the brand feel permanent. But Sansui lost visibility in the American market around 1988, and the original company went out of business in 2014. Sansui products can still appear in some markets under licensed naming, but that is not the same as the old hi-fi company that lived inside the family argument. The long-range mystery begins to sharpen. The wanted receiver survived, while the saving ritual around the name did not. Nakamichi and Dual disappeared in a different way because they were tied to physical rituals. Nakamichi is said to have released the Model 1000 in 1972 as the first 3-head cassette deck, then the Dragon in 1982 with automatic azimuth correction. Those decks made cassette recording feel deliberate, almost ceremonial. A good cassette deck was not background gear. It asked someone to sit there in real time, set levels, clean heads, watch meters, and make a tape for the car or a friend. When Nakamichi stopped making cassette decks in 1996 and later filed for bankruptcy in 2002, the household ritual around the cassette had already been losing its place. Dual carried the other ritual, the one under a dust cover. Dual is said to have begun in Germany's Black Forest region in 1907, long before families were choosing racks for split-level living rooms. A Dual CS505 or CS1228 belonged to the age when lowering a tone arm had its own small discipline. The compact disc era hurt turntable culture, but a single format shift is too simple. Dual later passed through ownership and licensing changes, and the modern brand presence is disconnected from the old engineering identity many owners remember. Halfway through this story, the question changes inside the store. If the same old names were drifting, who was left to explain whether Dad was buying engineering, nostalgia, or a box that only looked serious behind smoked glass? That job once belonged to a retail layer that has mostly vanished from family memory. Pacific Stereo, Tech Hi-Fi, Crazy Eddie, The Wiz, Tweeter, and Radio Shack were not the same kind of business, but they helped translate confusing specs into household choices. A salesperson could switch speakers, explain a receiver, and watch a family discover that their budget had limits. Pacific Stereo reportedly had 130 stores before CBS liquidated it in 1983. The Wiz was acquired by Cablevision for $80 million in 1998 and was later shut down after heavy losses. Tweeter's decline became sharper still when 600 employees were reportedly fired over the phone on the morning of December 2, 2008. Radio Shack played a different role. Realistic was its house brand, not an independent manufacturer, and that distinction matters. But for small towns and mall shoppers, a Realistic STA series receiver or Minimus 7 speakers could make component sound accessible because the store was nearby. If this kind of retail memory is the part of audio history that keeps bringing a room back to life, stay with this channel because the next pieces follow the same household trail. The smoked glass cabinet now returns in a different position. It stands beside a growing television setup, carrying gear chosen for stereo listening, while the room slowly turns toward the screen. Home theater began shifting attention from a left and right music room to surround effects, video inputs, and the question of how the movie sounded. That was not a moral failure. It was convenience and category drift, doing what they usually do. The family room had one major display. More devices wanted to plug into it, and sound increasingly followed the picture. I should also correct a story people like to make too neat. The old brands were not all beaten because the new gear was cheap junk, and the old gear was not automatically better because it had silver knobs. What changed was the chain of teaching, saving, comparing, and upgrading that gave those knobs public meaning. ADS is the useful detour because it proves how deep some vanished living room names were. Dr. Godehard Ginther came to the United States in 1966 to work for NASA, then moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1974. He imported Braun drivers, assembled and sold finished products in the United States, and later built under the ADS name. That is not the kind of story most families heard while standing in front of speaker grills. They heard what fit the room, what sounded clear, and what could be paid for. Yet ADS L810 and L910 speakers still turn up as especially wanted vintage pieces, because engineering stories sometimes outlive the stores that once explained them. By the early 2000s, household audio and video had not simply disappeared. U.S. household audio and video equipment manufacturers reported sales of $7.6 billion, compared with about $6.6 billion in the first half of the 1990s and $7.2 billion in the latter half. The money had moved through different categories, ownership structures, and production geography. U.S. companies focused largely on speakers and advanced technology televisions, while most other consumer electronics components sold in the United States were made abroad or made domestically by foreign companies. At the same time, listening kept spreading into smartphones, streaming, Bluetooth speakers, earbuds, and soundbars. More audio filled daily life, but less of it required a family to gather around a rack. This is the peak of the disappearance. Music did not vanish, audio gear did not vanish, and every famous brand did not die. The family stereo ritual vanished, where a brand meant a shared room, a saved paycheck, a Saturday demonstration, and a public argument over what the house would hear together. That is why the Sansui 9090DB can still be wanted online, while Sansui no longer functions as the name a family saves for at the stereo shop. The receiver became a collectible object. The old buying ritual lost the room that made it ordinary. The cabinet comes back now in a basement, a garage sale, or a classified photo with one door slightly off its track. Names like Sansui, Marantz, ADS, JBL, and Pioneer surface in wanted lists and resale pages, beside pieces like the Marantz 2270, JBL L100, Pioneer H PM100, ADS L810, ADS L910, and Harman Kardon 730 Twin. The old Sunday newspaper ad has become a search result. Some of those names still belong to living companies, and some belong to memories that outlasted the firms behind them. Vintage shops and buyers still trade amplifiers, speakers, tuners, turntables, cassette decks, CD players, cables, and records. The afterlife is real, but it is no longer the same family errand. The quiet part is easier to recognize than to measure. Dust settles on smoked glass, a power switch clicks softly, and a tuner glow comes up in a dim room. Modern convenience won for good reasons, because a phone and a small speaker can do in seconds what once took a cabinet, a receipt drawer, and somebody crouched behind the rack with a flashlight. The loss is not that every home needs to return to heavy receivers and tangled cables. The loss is that ordinary families once had a shared language for sound, and many of those brand names were the words inside that language. And if the stereo cabinet was the family altar, the next mystery is the store wall that made ordinary people believe they could hear the difference. Did your family own a smoked glass stereo cabinet?